choo. Man, I wish I had the sound guy's job. That really is. But shit, this is rolling. Your mother was a hamster, and your father smelled of elders. Hi, I'm fake Sean, I guess.
And I'm Arlyeon. Wait, what?
Deal with it.
God damn it.
And today, we're going to do our best to escape from the darkest depths of a dungeon. No, not the darkest dungeon, but rather from the eponymous bottom of Lamina Studios' Dungeon Souls.
Essentially, it's a top-down roguelite, emphasis on the light, with combat that tends to focus on dealing with vast swarms of enemies, and quantities of projectiles that might occasionally think you may have stumbled into a bullet hell. But is it enough to keep the gameplay fresh and interesting, or is the experience a different sort of hell? Find out in this episode of Critical Review.
And the weird switch of experiences for us is actually the keyboard controls that win the day. Historically on the show, this were gamepad controls that would have been ideal, but in Dungeon Souls, the mouse and keyboard controls are perfect, and everything about controls is responsive. The WASD key is move, the mouse aims, the number key is use your potions, and the mouse buttons use your skills. The middle mouse button switch between your secondary and tertiary combat skills, as they are both mapped to the right mouse button. Now, if there was any input lag, I certainly never noticed it, and I never had to do the whole impossible stretch with your pinky to hit that just out of reach key that seems to frequently plague indie games that offer keyboard controls. So the takeaway? Well, keyboard controls are good. Finally.
On the controller side of things, it's not quite as intuitive. Whilst the controls and button presses themselves are fairly responsive, there's some rather central issues, such as the developers having decided to map your two alternate abilities to 3 keys. One key to activate your currently selected ability, one to select your secondary ability, and one to select your tertiary ability, as opposed to just having one to activate the secondary and one to activate the tertiary. I don't actually get why they did that. I mean, you have a secondary and a tertiary ability. Why do you make a key to switch between the two when you could just have them both fire their respective ability? Thank you, Lamina. But, it also doesn't help that you actually can't aim a number of the AoE abilities when using a controller, since they were distinctly made for using with a mouse, I guess, and only actually have the option of dropping them or activating them at your feet or when an enemy is directly on top of you in its AoE. Suffice to say, this makes a number of the abilities that certain classes possess less than appealing they would be when you're using a mouse and keyboard.
I really hate how frequently this seems to happen among indie games. I wish that devs would, give both sets of control equal levels of attention. Now, gamepad controls were actually added later with a patch by popular demand and were not originally intended to be an option in Dungeon Souls. But regardless, they should have done a lot more playtesting with them before they actually implemented gamepad controls. One of the main functions of the game is for classes, and the modifications that can be made to those classes. You start out with a small handful of classes that satisfy a fairly classic array of fantasy character tropes, each functioning in different ways to bring no shortage of options for playstyles. That list of options is further expanded on by unlocking more classes by way of just playing the game. I love that this game did not require you to do weird, random, seemingly arbitrary things just to unlock the rest of the classes. Just playing the game naturally is enough to unlock each class option by the time you get to the end of the game. Now, each class has their own array of starting stats and a unique passive, but the real nuance between each class actually comes from their skills. This game did a great job of making none of the skills between each class really feel samey. But that said, I really did not find myself using the secondary and tertiary skill all that much. I found that constantly boosting the primary attack in tandem with the appropriate stat that increases that skill's damage is more than sufficient to get you to the end of the game. Now, you will find though that the game tends to favour the ranged classes over the melee classes. That's not to say that the melee classes are not strong, as some of them do get stupidly strong if you level them. It's just, well, their power is a slow growth kind of thing, and new players are potentially going to have a rough time getting their melee character strong enough to really see that power come through. And, well, death means you do have to start over completely from the first dungeon. Dungeon Souls does offer a form of class progression that's often missing in games of this type.
To elaborate more on Sean's statement, I actually did dabble in the secondary and tertiary skills for some characters, such as the Cleric, Archer, and Viking for instance, because some of the classes need them so they can quickly clear out problematic rooms or enemy clusters. It also just helped in leveling, not only in regards to whilst playing that specific run, but also in regards to the game's ranking progression system. Character ranks are essentially a passive bonus to the class's base stats that slowly scale upwards as you gain experience, up to a maximum of rank 5. At max rank, the classes gain a sprite and name change, Cleric to Paladin, Archer to Ranger, Barbarian to Viking for instance, a sizable boost to most of their stats, and they gain an extra stat point whenever they level, in effect increasing their odds for successful clearing astronomically. You also gain a higher stat point for every 10 levels you've gained on your current character, well, to the pool of stats you gain, which definitely help for dabbling purposes. The other thing too is as you rank up, not only is it increasing your starting stats, it also actually increases the stat scaling for items you pick up. But anyways, with all this said, there is actually another system in place beyond ranks that provide players a form of persistent progression between playthroughs, making this game a far more forgiving roguelite experience, and that's the passive system. The passives are various stat boosts to all of your primary stats that you can acquire with whatever gold you haven't spent during a run, once you either died or cleared it. While subtle at first, they can amount to an astronomical boost to all the character stats when you've maxed out every individual one, and again, they apply to every single character on your account when you get a passive. And by the end of it, you've made a complete cakewalk out of the early areas. At least on normal difficulty.
Right, so the other method of tangible progress is the Forge. Eventually in your playthrough, you will stumble upon a magical bookshelf that takes you to a magical library where all the enemies have a chance of dropping recipes. More on that location later. Now, if you've been properly looting, as I'm sure you would have done, then you have, in addition to the gold that Arlyeon mentioned earlier, accumulated materials. You know, materials like bones, stones, magical dust, so on and so forth. Now each recipe will require a certain amount of those, as well as some gold, some definitely costing more than others, but the trade-off is definitely worth it, as you can create weapons that do additional effects like ice damage, fire damage, the ability to penetrate one enemy and deal damage to one behind it, you know, the list goes on. Each class can, of course, only equip certain weapons. That freeze effect is so nice. Ice, nice. Stones, bones.
Anyways, I was more of a Poltergeist fan, the piercing one for range characters, and fire for melee characters, but you know, hey, to each their own. So, yeah, I mentioned gold earlier, and that's an important detail as not only is the stuff useful for the passive system or the forging system, it's also extremely important during the run itself, as it's required to deal with the dungeon vendors. Whilst you can run around and collect the game's potions and passive trinkets without the help of the merchant, the fact that these items can grant passives ranging from decent to extremely powerful to potentially game-breaking, extra health, reduced cooldowns, and extra experience whenever you crit, respectively, it does make the choice of saving gold for the passive systems or purchasing gear in the hopes of being able to make your way further into the dungeon a situation of risk versus reward, especially since the merchant's cost increase the further into the dungeon you go.
That said, you can actually find ways to reduce the cost of the in-game items, or at least offset them by way of a passive that increases gold, or by finding items that either reduce the cost of shop purchases, or just outright increase the amount that enemies yield upon killing them. Which, I suppose, brings us to the enemies themselves. I actually really appreciated the variety of enemies in this game, and the diverse mechanics that they brought with them. See, each section of the dungeon has 2 floors, followed by a boss fight. My personal favourite of which, for the look and feel at least, was probably the Forbidden Library. Each floor has its own distinct feel and aesthetic, which is matched by the enemies. It would have been so easy for the developers to fall into the old standby of just palette swapping the enemies and moving on, but instead each floor set of enemies all function fairly differently from each other. The snow level was full of enemies that bombard you with freeze attacks and area of effects, while the obligatory sewer level was full of slimes that just love to duplicate and spew poison. Lovely. Lastly, the enemies never stop spawning. There is no completely clearing the floor. A section of the map that you previously cleared out can suddenly be full of enemies that ambush you if you get too cocky, keeping you on your toes every step of the way. Some areas are more challenging than others, but none of them are really forgettable. The bosses, some are cooler than others. There are a few that really feel like they're just superpowered versions of regular enemies, and to be honest, those ones feel a little bit flat. But the fight with the others, such as Merlin or the Soul Guardian, were definitely distinct and exciting.
Yeah, there's definitely a franticness to some of the bosses that is gorgeous, though it does make using a melee character a bit of a sad face experience at times if you got unlucky with some of the drops or didn't quite know where to place your points at first, especially if they happen to be faster than you. Also, especially when you first stumble into one of the secret levels, one of which was already referenced by Sean. See, while you're wandering around the dungeon, you can come across either a golden bookshelf or a strange tree. Both of these in the second floor of those respective stages, being the dungeon initial area or the snowy plain. Occasionally, however, instead of being like strange tree or golden bookshelf, it'll say forbidden library or fey garden, and clicking on them will transport you to a hidden set of stages, with enemies that are generally far more brutal than the norm. Both of them provide the utility of allowing you to get a full 2 stages worth of extra experience and potential vendors before venturing onto the area that would normally come after the stage you came from, with the Forbidden Library also providing recipes, backstory, and a potential boost of stats, and a decent item once you've done something. More than that, however, both these stages require you to do something so as to acquire the good ending. Which, yes, spoilers, there's a generic ending, a good ending, and a bad ending if you're an owl-murdering jerkhole, which I guess is tied to the secret levels too.
The multiplayer is a mess. As much as I really enjoy this game, it is impossible to defend all the flaws and failings that Dungeon Souls co-op mode brings to the table. This is made more grating by the fact that if one of the 2 players dies, they stay dead until after the next boss fight. And, well, since a number of boss fights can become bullet hells, yeah, it's pretty bad. Because it is local co-op only, you will be locked into sharing a screen, which is a problem in the game that demands that you have awareness of your surroundings. Arlyeon and I died so frequently simply because our reaction times were severely handicapped by only having half of the screen to look at any given time. And when we added gamepad controls, they also made it so that one player is locked into using the gamepad, which, as we mentioned, are garbage to use. If one player opens their menu, the other player is rendered unable to attack. You can still move, but your skills will not function until the other player leaves the menu. You know, it's just altogether not a fun experience, which is a shame, especially when the simple task of leveling up has turned into a game of cross your fingers and hope you don't get your partner killed while you look at your stat menu. Dungeon Souls is a delightful single player experience and has all the potential of being a great multiplayer experience in the vein of the old school Gauntlet games. But, well, sadly these design choices suck all that potential out and leave us nothing but frustrating gameplay.
Honestly, the simple fact that the game isn't paused when you're choosing stats or skills in general is sort of mean, and to do so and multiplayer, and especially on higher difficulties, basically comes off as an almost sadistic choice on the part of the devs. Between that and half the screen turning black when your partner dies, because, as Sean mentioned, there's no reviving your buddy, and then potentially having to slog through a pair of dungeon floors with a nerfed field of vision was some of my least pleasant memories of the game. The only one that manages to trump that is the save bug, although the other bugs weren't that great either. And just total honesty here, there's been a number of bugs in the game. It happens in indie games, especially one that is updated as frequently as this, and there's a number of events such as the Halloween event, and there's probably going to be a Christmas event, there was a Valentine's Day event, and Lamina Studios is remarkably on point for addressing them when they occur, whether it be the anomalous crash caused by exploding slimes, which was patched in a handful of days, to an inability to open the passives menu when using a controller. That was a pain, but was also fixed. they're pretty damn diligent, which makes the fact that they have a bug in the game which deletes your save file pretty damn offensive. Specifically, they have a bit of programming that alerts you if something in your save file isn't synced and then asks if it can fix it. And by fix it, it means rolling back your progress an arbitrary and sometimes massive amount. I lost a good 9 hours to this, several characters maxed and all passives acquired, and basically had to take a nice long break from the game. And this was back when there was other bugs in there too, so I needed a nice long break from it so that when things actually got addressed for a lot of the other ones, I could actually go in and be like, I think I can do this. And I can only imagine, like, it'll get addressed eventually, sooner rather than later, I hope, given their track record. But it was heartrending that it not only managed to happen once due to a bug, but then again due to a system they put in place, and that it still persists in having that system. You might at first mistake Dungeon Souls for one of those more arcadey entries in the gaming world that just don't have much of a story, given that there's no intro or item descriptions to read for snatches of lore. And really, it does come off as extremely arcadey and gameplay focused, until you reach a boss for the first time and are greeted with not only some nifty and intimidating voice-acted dialogue, but also a sense of why you're here. And it's this part where it's implied that the player characters are trying to escape this dungeon rather than plunder its depths. Whilst a few variants for each of the boss greetings do exist, they all tend to hint towards an overarching narrative, one which is completed by the 4 books the players gain access to after the first time they beat the Merlin boss. Not only does this give the players a fairly nice overview of the present situation, that last info dump also provides players hints on how to acquire the game's endings, tying together gameplay and story neatly. And you'll need to read those books once for it to acknowledged by the game for the rest of your playthrough, so it's nice and convenient too. Overall, I enjoyed it, though I will forewarn that for the people who had a fit over the genocide ending and its repercussions in Undertale, you're going to be likely less than pleased at the repercussions for being a jerk in Dungeon Souls. Though, being a jerk to the last boss is both acknowledged by the game and hilarious.
Right. Yeah, there is one instance in the game where you are given a choice to do one of 2 things to an NPC. Now, this is the only time that this situation of choice really happens until you get to the end, and you have no reason to suspect that it will completely lock you out of a good ending. And that the only way to ever get a good ending, if you do make that choice, is to completely erase your save and start all over again. Other than that, it is another sweet case of, take the story if you want it, with the option of just playing the game without having to choke down a bunch of lore or swim in an obnoxious sea of cutscenes. And, well, if you do choose to take the story, it is fairly concise. Digesting all lore might take you, all of an extra 5 minutes or so on a standard playthrough. But it's nice, and, the story, while seemingly simple, has just enough nuance to make you furrow your brow a bit.
Dungeon Souls is a top-down sprite-based dungeon crawler, and a very good-looking one at that. Player characters and their animations are simple yet charming, and the final ranked variants of all the classes were nice and distinct from their initial form. The game's environments were very appealing to look at, and avoided the issue of looking samey between each one, both in their palette sets as well as the enemy appearances for each area, changing up every 2 stages and keeping things quite fresh. That, and the boss designs were neat. The only thing that really actually started to look a little bit samey was when you came across more powerful variants of enemies. They were color-coded for convenience as either red variants, blue variants, or yellow variants for the champions. I think the yellow ones were the hardest, and it's like red for I'm mad, blue for like I'm gonna make you sad, and yellow for I hope you're wearing your yellow pants was, I think, their strength rating. But yeah.
I don't have much more to add to this in regards to the game's graphics and overall aesthetic. As I mentioned earlier, the game brings a really nice level of diversity to the table, with each floor and each floor set of monsters being different than the last. Nothing feels cookie cutter, which can be, pretty rare these days if I'm quite honest. Pachoo! Pachoo! Pachoo!
So like, I really like the audio in this game, from the sound effects of your abilities to the items you acquire. Everything has a certain satisfying arcade-like noise to it. And yet, despite everything that's going on, it never actually drowns out the game's soundtrack, which is a good thing considering the OST is just pretty darn lovely. Even so, I was more than disappointed by the moments where I was greeted by silence, such as following a boss's death. Instead of victory music, things just wind down to this quiet, empty silence. On the subject of the bosses, however, I straight up just adored the fact that they had spoken dialogue. Not only for just the story aspects, for just that extra bit of dramatic oomph that it afforded those encounters as you stepped onto their floor. Like, damn, for the first time, great.
Yeah, I mean, games like this can have a problem with becoming way too chaotic in their sound design when the screen becomes full of enemies. You know, every enemy spewing an attack combined with your own typically creates a situation where it all becomes sound and fury signifying nothing. Dungeon Souls, on the other hand, doesn't have this problem. The music is never muffled because most sound effects are short and sweet and slightly muted so as not to overwhelm the music. The music itself has a really nice booming bass heavy feel to it, that I felt would be quite home even in more modernly designed RPGs with much larger budgets. As, well, the pickier one out of us both when it comes to music, I am aware that I can frequently be hard to please, but the composer really managed to bring an excellent dramatic flair to a game with his musical touches.
Honestly, this one was incredibly hard for me to rate. Originally, my thoughts on the game had leaned more towards the negative because wading through bugs had soured a number of my experiences with it. When Lamina came forward and hammered out a lot of what was going awry, I was able to really delve into the guts of the game, and I came away with what I felt was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. Mechanically, it was a really addictive roguelite, which allowed you a sense of growth as you invested time and leveled characters, weapons, and passives, and also rewarded skill and dabbling in the various item and skill combinations. Oh, and bumbling into the good ending was just amazing for me, which I suppose is why I found it so weird that for having such a solid single-player experience, it just could fall so short in the co-op department. This game, if it could refine that aspect, would be top tier. But between the bugs that crop up, and especially the save bug, issues with the controller and skill matters, and just co-op, it doesn't quite make it. It is still something I would totally suggest if you're a fan of roguelites, roguelikes, or just arcadey style, almost bullet hell-y, arena style dungeon crawls. Like, just pick this up if you're into that. Just don't go into this game if you're looking for a co-op experience, and don't let this game, air quote, recover your save, end air quote. Essentially, I consider this game a solid hit, but its co-op experience would not even be a fumble, it would be an outright fail.
This whole review has been a complicated process. This one took us the longest by far to write because of all the turmoil that surrounded this game. You know, a number of bugs that Arlyeon had encountered were actually caused by a patch that came out during a period of time where I had stopped playing the game for a while, so I didn't actually experience them until I had already developed an opinion on the game. And I am so happy that the bugs are fixed in a relatively timely manner because I really enjoyed Dungeon Souls. The art style satisfies my craving for retro nostalgia, and the music has a perfect amount of adventurous excitement and dramatic dread. And, well, it is mechanically sound enough that I can play for hours and not get bored. I personally fought really hard on this one to convince Arlyeon not to judge it by its bugs. And while I absolutely was, and still am, prepared to hold the game and its developers accountable for its flaws, I am super happy that I was able to ultimately share a positive experience with him and our viewers. So for me, this is a strong hit. As much as I want to call it a critical hit, the issues present with co-op and a small remaining bug or two unfortunately knock it down a peg or two on the scale. And if those issues are ever fixed, I would absolutely consider Dungeon Souls a flawless gaming experience. So, all in all, for us, Dungeon Souls is a hit. well, let's not talk about the co-op. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this episode, and even if you didn't, well, tell us why in the comments below. We're ever grateful for every like, comment and subscription, and if you're interested in spreading the word of our channel, well, sharing is caring. And with that, have a great morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you folks are.